Welcome back to CRYPTID'S Den. Every time you return, it brings back a quiet feeling, like the echo of a night we've shared before. I hope today gave you a small moment of peace. Tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing where these stories land. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and leave a comment. I'd really love to hear from you. Now, let's get into it. They told me the woods were empty. Just trees, wind, and old stories. But I know now. Something still lives out there. And it's not hunting. It's remembering. When I followed my boyfriend to his grandma's cabin in Idaho, I expected a boring weekend. Awkward silences, dusty photo albums. But then I saw it. A figure, tall and limping, standing just beyond the trees, watching us. Not like a threat. More like a memory that never left. His grandmother, Edith, used to leave things by the window. Warm cloth, apples, popcorn. And every night, something came to take them. After she passed, I stayed. I started leaving little gifts of my own, and it kept coming. Quiet, grieving. Watching the light from the TV like it missed someone who once sat there. In this video, I'll show you what it gave me in return. And why I believe some legends aren't legends at all. They're just love, waiting to be seen again. I used to think people exaggerated when they talked about silence in the woods. How it settles on your skin like damp mist. How it makes your heart beat louder than your footsteps. But I remember the first time I visited Fern Hollow, and how the quiet there didn't feel empty. It felt like something was listening. Colby didn't want to go. Of course he didn't. His relationship with his grandmother had always been distant, strained even. But when her neighbor called to say she hadn't been seen in 5 days, and the mail was piling up on the porch, I convinced him. It was early spring, the kind of March in Idaho that still bites your face at night and tricks you with soft sun during the day. The drive up to Fern Hollow wound through dense pine and cedar, trees so tall they pressed the sky into narrow ribbons. I remember thinking the forest looked ancient, unbothered by us. Edith Hayes lived in a moss-covered cabin tucked behind a bend in the old county road. The windows were wide and low, framed by thick, creaky shutters. A wind chime made of deer bones and rusted spoons hung from the eaves. When we pulled up, there was no sign of movement. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like I'd stepped into a place that wasn't quite mine to enter. Edith opened the door before we knocked. Her body was frail, hunched slightly, but her eyes, though cloudy from age, still held a sharpness that could cut through fog. "Took you long enough," she said dryly to Colby. Then her gaze slid past him, and she smiled at me. A warm, unguarded smile. I felt it settle into my ribs. Inside, the cabin smelled of lavender, old newspapers, and something faintly smoky. The walls were lined with books, shelves packed so full they sagged. There was no TV, just a large window that faced the woods like an altar. I remember staring at it, hypnotized. There was something about the way the light fell through the trees outside, dappled and golden but never quite reaching the glass. Like the forest had stopped trying to come in a long time ago. Dinner was awkward. Colby scrolled on his phone between mouthfuls of canned chili. Edith ate slowly, deliberately, her eyes flicking between us. Halfway through, she asked me what I did. When I told her I designed books about wildlife, something in her face softened. She asked what I believed in. I told her I believed the world still had secrets, that not every mystery needed solving, that some things deserve to stay wild. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and then said something that silenced the room. "Do you ever wonder who watches the woods when we're not looking?" Colby scoffed. I didn't. I felt the hairs on my arm rise. The room felt colder somehow. Edith went quiet again, but her fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the edge of her glass. I watched her as the light from the fire played shadows across her face, casting her age in high relief. After dinner, while Colby took a call outside, Edith invited me into the living room. The couch was worn but clean, the walls hung with faded photographs. She gestured toward the window. "I keep that uncovered," she said, voice low. "It helps me remember." "Remember what?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She didn't look at me when she said it. "I promise." There was a long pause. Then she turned her head slightly. "Do you believe," she asked, "that some things return not because they're lost, but because they're loyal?" I didn't know what to say. Her voice wasn't wistful. It was certain. Before we left, I excused myself to use the bathroom but detoured through the kitchen. That's when I saw it. A large wooden bowl on the floor near the back door. Flecks of popcorn and apple cores inside. Not a dog bowl. Bigger than that. Something about the way it was positioned, half in shadow, directly in line with the window, sent a strange chill down my spine. Colby was impatient to leave. The moment we hit the road, he turned up the music and muttered about crazy old women and paranoia. I didn't respond. My mind was still in that cabin, still pressed against the window glass, still hearing the way Edith's voice had dropped to a whisper at the end of dinner. "She never really left," she had said, as though speaking of someone we had all once known. Back home in Boise, I couldn't stop thinking about her. About the way she looked past the trees when she talked, not into them, like something waited just beyond the frame. That night I found myself Googling stories from Fern Hollow. Most were small-town myths. Sightings of strange silhouettes. Sounds in the night, missing livestock, chalked up to bears or bad luck. But one detail kept repeating. People mentioned seeing something tall. Something that stood still, something that watched. When I closed my laptop, the silence in our apartment felt wrong. It didn't comfort me. It felt hollow. Like a copy of silence, missing the weight of something real. In bed, Colby turned his back to me. I stared at the ceiling, picturing Edith sitting alone in that cabin, staring into the woods with no TV, no family, just the echo of footsteps that maybe only she could hear. I didn't know what I had stepped into yet, but I knew this. There are places that don't just keep secrets, they cradle them. And the people who remain in those places, people like Edith, aren't waiting to be rescued. They're waiting to be believed. And some part of me already did. I couldn't stop thinking about her. All week, Edith's voice stayed lodged in my chest like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. The way she stared through that window, the way she said some things came back, not because they were lost, but because they were loyal. It didn't feel like a metaphor. It felt like a warning I hadn't yet understood. By Friday morning, I was already packed. Colby rolled his eyes when I told him we were driving back to Fern Hollow for the weekend. But I didn't give him much of a choice. I told him we needed to bring her something. Something more than groceries and awkward company. I'd ordered a 65-inch flat screen that would just barely fit in the back of the car, and picked it up that morning. I added a few things to the back seat too, though I didn't tell Colby why. 2 bags of kettle corn, a jar of raw honey, and a bundle of ripe apples from the farmer's market. They weren't really for her, not all of them. The drive was long, nearly 7 hours with ferry crossings, winding back roads and thick clouds that followed us like a threat. Colby barely spoke, except to complain about traffic near Coeur d'Alene and the god-awful radio reception. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, at the back seat, at that huge box, and the bag of apples beside it. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe nothing. Maybe too much. We reached Fern Hollow just before sunset. The sky was the kind of bruised purple that made the tree line look sharper, like it was cut out of black velvet. The cabin looked the same, still quiet, still standing like it had been waiting for us. Edith opened the door before we knocked again. Her voice was thinner this time, but her eyes sparked when she saw me. Colby brought the TV in, grumbling about the weight, but she didn't react to the size of the thing like I expected. No amazement, no surprise. She just stood in the middle of the living room and pointed at a spot. Not on the main wall, not in front of the couch, but opposite the large picture window that looked out into the trees. "There," she said, voice soft. "It goes there, but it's not facing the couch," Colby said. "It's not for me to watch from the couch," Edith replied, and walked into the kitchen. He threw me a look, but I ignored it. Together, we mounted the TV where she wanted it, right where the forest could see it. The rest of the evening passed in that strange, humming quiet that always seemed to settle inside her walls. She didn't say much, just made tea, and sat in her favorite chair, facing that window like always. She never looked at the screen. She didn't even ask us to turn it on. Colby disappeared into the spare room with his laptop. Pretending to work, I stayed up late, staring out the window, trying to make sense of something I couldn't name. That night I barely slept. I thought I heard something creak on the back porch. I thought I smelled something sweet, burnt sugar, maybe popcorn. But when I got up to check, the kitchen was empty. The forest outside was pitch black, solid and unknowable. I stood by the window longer than I should have, breath fogging the glass. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I wandered into the living room and nearly tripped over a basket near the front door. I could have sworn it hadn't been there the night before. Inside was the unopened jar of honey and one of the bags of apples, except some of the apples were gone. Cleanly bitten, not chewed, as if someone, or something, had picked them over. There was also a small, smooth stone in the bottom of the basket. Shiny, pinkish gray. It looked like rose quartz, polished by hand. I picked it up. It was warm. I didn't tell Colby. He wouldn't have believed me. I just slipped the stone into my pocket and said we should get the rest of our stuff from the car. He didn't notice anything strange. He never does. That afternoon, we helped Edith with yard work. She had us trim the hedges and rake leaves, though I noticed she never strayed far from the window. Around 4, she went back inside and turned on the television. Colby and I followed. On the screen was some old Bugs Bunny cartoon, grainy and loud. I remember thinking it felt out of place, too bright, too cheerful for a cabin this still. But she watched the forest, not the screen. "It helps him relax," she said quietly. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I heard her right. Or maybe I was afraid that I had. When night fell, I sat by the window alone. The air outside was cold, the sky low and full of stars. The trees swayed just a little. The TV flickered behind me, filling the room with soft, jumpy light. I didn't know what I was waiting for until it happened. At exactly 11:08 p.m., the shadows outside shifted. My breath caught. Something tall, taller than any man, stood at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see its face. Just a silhouette, massive and unmoving, staring toward the window. Staring toward me. No, not me. The screen. It stood there for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move. My heart was a hammer in my throat. I couldn't explain what I was seeing, but I knew it was real. As real as the cold seeping through the glass. As real as the faint smell of old pine and damp fur that slid in behind it. And then it turned, walked away, limping. I watched until the dark took it back. When I turned around, Edith was behind me. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded. "It comes when the cartoons are on," she said. "He likes the music, the colors. It calms the old fear, I think." I wanted to ask who he was, what he was, why he came. But I didn't. I sat down on the floor, facing the screen. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Edith leaned on the doorframe and whispered, like a mother telling a secret bedtime story. "He used to come for me. Now, I think he comes for the sound of something that doesn't change." And I realized, as the flickering light danced on the walls, that I wasn't scared. I was mourning something I didn't even understand yet. Something enormous, something lonely. And I had a feeling he'd be back tomorrow night. I didn't expect to sleep that night. The cabin felt too alert, like something under the floorboards had a pulse of its own. The cartoon still flickered from the giant screen even after midnight. Washing the walls in color, no one was watching. Colby was passed out in the spare room, snoring like a lawnmower in slow death. Edith had gone to bed around 11 without a word, as if the day's ritual had been fulfilled, and there was nothing left to say. But I stayed up, perched near the window, like a shadow that hadn't decided if it wanted to leave or stay. The forest outside was ink, dense, unmoving, heavy with something I couldn't name. I kept expecting a breeze to shake the trees, an animal to rustle the brush, anything. But the stillness clung to the world like frost. I kept listening, straining for any trace of presence. At some point, I must have dozed off with my head resting against the frame. I woke up to sound. It was faint, not a crash or creak, but something softer. A shuffling accompanied by the low hum of the cartoon still looping on screen. I blinked hard and looked around. Nothing in the room had moved, but the air felt off, like it had been rearranged in my sleep. That's when I smelled it. Butter. Slightly burnt. Sweet popcorn. But no one had been in the kitchen. No one but me. And I hadn't touched the stove. I stood up slowly. My knees cracked louder than I meant them to, and I froze. Nothing. I moved toward the kitchen and saw the microwave light blinking. Off. No warmth from the oven. No pots out. But the scent was unmistakable. Then came another sound, clearer now. A low thump. Wood against wood. Followed by something even stranger. A laugh. Laugh. Light. Breathless. Too soft to be Colby. Too young to be Edith. Almost. I turned back toward the living room and froze. The chair by the window, the one would never moved, the one angled slightly toward the forest, was no longer still. It had turned, just enough to face the screen more directly. No footsteps, no sound of dragging, just that tiny, imperceptible shift. And now, it sat there like someone had just risen from it. The throw blanket was bunched at one corner, like a hand had pressed into it and left a shape behind. I glanced at the window. Nothing but my own reflection. I didn't breathe. And then, something moved beyond the glass. Not a deer, not a raccoon. Something upright, tall. A single stride across the edge of the clearing, too smooth, too heavy to be wind. I pressed closer and saw it. For only a second, but enough. The top half of something massive, covered in dark fur, slipping between the trees like a phantom that had learned patience. It didn't look in my direction. It looked at the television, and then it vanished. I couldn't speak. My body didn't know whether to collapse or run. I backed away from the window like it might shatter under the weight of what I'd just seen. When I turned, Edith was standing in the hallway. She wasn't surprised. She didn't ask me what I saw. She said, "It only stays if we don't chase it." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. She walked past me into the kitchen and returned with a worn metal popcorn tin, faded red and gold with a picture of a snowman on it. She placed it on the floor beneath the window, near the same spot the bowl had been the other day. "For tomorrow," she said, and walked back to bed. I stood in the living room a long time after that. My heart didn't slow for nearly an hour. I sat in the chair that had turned itself and stared out into the dark. The cartoon ended and the screen went black, showing me only my own wide-eyed reflection and the faint outline of trees. When morning came, the world had the nerve to act like nothing happened. The sun rose. Birds sang. Colby made coffee like he hadn't missed a damn thing. I walked outside and found the popcorn tin gone. In its place, beside the porch, was a muddy trail of scattered kernels and one footprint. Massive, 4 toes, wide heel, deeply set, as if whatever made it had been favoring one leg. A limp. Colby didn't notice it, or he pretended not to. Back inside, I walked into the living room. Edith was already seated in her chair, looking out through the glass, not moving, not blinking, just present. Like a statue cast in patience. I sat beside her. She spoke so softly I almost didn't catch it. "He'd watched cartoons with me for years," she said. "Sometimes it would hum. Sometimes it would mimic the music, but it never came this close until it started limping." I looked at her, then back at the trees. "It's hurt?" I asked. "Something out there doesn't want it here anymore," she said. "But it remembers this place. It remembers me." She leaned forward, eyes fixed on the line where forest met clearing. "He's not just watching. He's returning." And I believed her, every word, because nothing in me could deny the shape I'd seen in the dark. The shift in the air, the seat that still carried heat. That night, I stayed by the window again. I didn't bring a flashlight. I didn't bring a phone, just a thermos of tea and a blanket. The TV flickered to life behind me, and I waited for the sound of breath that wasn't mine. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning arrived quietly, like it knew better than to disturb anything. The kind of quiet that settles on your skin, not just your ears. Colby was still asleep, but I was up before the sun had climbed fully over the ridgeline. The world outside the cabin was still wet with dew, and the pine stood motionless in the kind of air that feels like it's waiting. I slipped into my boots, stepped onto the porch, and felt the cold wood press up through my socks. The basket was gone again. In its place, just past the edge of the porch, there was a strange arrangement. 12 apples. All different sizes, laid out in a spiral pattern. In the center sat another stone. This one wasn't polished like the last. It was rougher, more jagged, with streaks of deep blue running through the gray like veins. I didn't touch it right away. I crouched next to the pattern and stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out if it had been made with intention or just scattered by chance. But the spacing was too perfect. Too human in its precision, and yet not. I brought the stone inside and set it gently on the windowsill. Edith didn't say anything at first when she saw it. She just looked at it with the kind of familiarity people reserve for old scars. She sipped her coffee, eyes fixed on the trees. "It remembers," she finally said. "It knows when someone notices it, and it knows when they pretend not to." I asked if she'd ever left it gifts. She smiled, and her eyes welled up in a way that made my stomach twist. "Only once," she said. "Only once," she said. "Right after my husband passed. I hadn't seen it in decades, but that night, it came back. Just for a moment. Stood at the edge of the clearing and didn't move. I left bread and honey on the porch the next night. And the next. By the third morning, only the plate was gone." She stood slowly and walked to a drawer, pulling out a faded photograph. She handed it to me without speaking. The photo was old, sepia-toned and worn at the corners. It showed a much younger Edith, maybe 12 or 13, standing by the creek behind the cabin. She was barefoot, grinning at the camera. But just behind her, barely visible in the tree line, was something tall, something dark, not in focus, but definitely not a shadow. Its shape was too precise. Shoulders too wide. It looked like it was ducking, watching. She took the photo back before I could ask more. "I used to play out there for hours," she whispered. "It never came too close. Just stayed at the edge. But I always knew when it was there. You don't forget that kind of presence." Later that day, while Colby tinkered with the TV settings and pretended not to listen, I followed Edith out to the edge of the clearing. We stood by the spot where the spiral of apples had been, just outside the porch light's reach. She pointed to a large cedar tree. "See that scar?" she said. And I did. A deep gash running sideways across the trunk, like something massive had scraped it once, long ago. That happened the night it screamed. I was 16. Something had wounded it. I heard it howl, this low, guttural sound that shook the windows. I never forgot that noise. She placed a hand on the bark. It didn't come back for a long time after that. Years. I thought maybe it died. But part of me wondered if it just needed to find someplace quieter. That evening, I couldn't stop staring at the TV screen. We turned it on just after dinner. More old cartoons, all slapstick in color. The room filled with laughter that no one in the house shared. Edith sat in her usual chair, eyes never leaving the forest. She seemed thinner that night. Like every story she'd told had shaved off a little more weight. After Colby went to bed, she asked me to stay up with her. So I did. We sat in silence, broken only by the soft loop of music from the television and the occasional pop of the fire. I almost didn't hear the first sound from outside. A branch cracked, not loudly, but in a way that was deliberate, like someone testing if we were paying attention. I reached for my phone but stopped. I didn't want to ruin it with a screen or a flash or anything that would break the spell. Instead, I pressed my hand to the glass. A shape moved just beyond the glow of the TV. Not close, not yet, but present. I watched it step forward, one slow footfall at a time. Just at the edge of the clearing now. Tall, hunched slightly, broad. The head tilted toward the window, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its focus like pressure on my chest. It didn't move further. It just stood there, and then it did something I never expected. It knelt. The movement was stiff, careful. It looked like it took effort. One leg didn't bend easily. I could tell. One arm supported the weight while the other pressed against the injured side. And as it settled into the dirt, it lifted its head toward the screen. The cartoon was playing a chase scene. Characters running in circles, shouting in sped-up voices. The kind of thing that makes children laugh. I didn't laugh. I couldn't. I was frozen. Edith leaned forward and whispered, "He remembers that one." I turned toward her slowly. "You've seen him react like this before?" I asked. She nodded. When his mother brought him, he liked the music, the rhythm. It made him sit still. I looked back at the shape in the clearing. Still watching. Still unmoving. And something shifted in me. It wasn't just awe. It was grief. A strange kind of mourning for a creature I didn't know, but who clearly knew us. That's what hit hardest, that it knew. When the cartoon ended, the figure stood with effort, turned, and disappeared into the trees. I wanted to follow, but I didn't. Instead, I pressed my hand to the window again, where his gaze had just been. The glass was cold, but something about the air on the other side wasn't. It was warm, and it lingered. The day we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the ground beneath us. It wasn't just what I'd seen the night before or what I'd felt through the glass. It was the way the forest had gone quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. This one felt like breath held in a pair of lungs far too large to belong to anything human. We'd planned to drive back to Boise early, but I lingered that morning. I made excuses. Rechecking tire pressure, helping Edith sweep the porch, double-checking the pantry like we were coming back tomorrow. Colby was already getting impatient, tapping at his phone and pacing the driveway. He kept asking if I'd left my charger, my shoes, my mind. We didn't even make it 2 hours down the highway before it happened. A hard, sudden pop beneath the car, like a gunshot that had been waiting. The whole vehicle lurched. Colby swerved, cursed, pulled off into a gravel turnout on the side of a winding 2-lane road halfway through nowhere. The rear tire had blown clean apart. Shreds of rubber flapped like dead skin. He opened the trunk and just stared, jaw clenched. No spare. No jack. I didn't even ask why. There was no reception. No cars passed for over an hour. We tried flagging down 2 trucks that barreled by without slowing, both swallowed instantly by the trees. It got dark faster than it should have. The wind picked up and brought with it a cold that felt unnatural for early spring. I wrapped myself in a blanket from the back seat and tried not to think about the way the trees on either side of the road leaned just a little too far in. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke up to a tapping on the window. Not hard, gentle, measured. I thought maybe Colby had gotten out, maybe figured something out. But he was asleep in the driver's seat, mouth open, head tilted. I turned slowly, heart punching into my ribs. A man in uniform stood outside my door, illuminated by the dull orange glow of a patrol truck's running lights. RCMP. I rolled down the window and tried to keep my voice steady. He asked if we were all right. Told us someone had reported a car off the shoulder about 5 miles back and he came to check. He had tools. He had a spare. He had eyes that lingered too long on the edge of the woods, as if he'd been listening to something I couldn't hear. It was close to 1:15 a.m. by the time we rolled back into Fern Hollow. The forest looked different under that hour's light, thinner, stretched, like it had nothing left to hide. We pulled into the gravel lot beside Edith's cabin and killed the engine. Colby stayed behind, too tired or too proud to come inside. I went ahead. The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was the color. The TV was on, blazing with blue and red animation that flickered across the walls in sharp pulses, and in the center of it, framed in that huge front window, was a shape. Not just tall, towering. It stood just outside the cabin, so close to the window that its breath had fogged part of the glass. Shoulders broad, arms low, hands curled slightly forward like they didn't know where to rest anymore. Its head tilted slightly as it stared into the screen. The TV's light made the fine hairs along its jawline shimmer. Dark chestnut, coarse but clean. And the eyes. They weren't glowing like in stories. They were wet, reflective, wounded. I didn't scream. My body was too frozen for that. My fingers clenched around the doorknob like it was the only thing anchoring me to now. I watched as the creature leaned forward slightly. One hand pressed gently against the glass. The other held at its side, favoring the leg I'd seen limp before. Its torso was scarred. Not just scratched, scarred. Old wounds. Deep, discolored skin between patches of fur. One shoulder rose higher than the other. I could see it breathe. Then it turned. Slow. Careful. Not startled. It looked over its shoulder into the tree line, like it had heard something only it could hear. Then it stepped back. 1, 2 strides, and melted into the darkness. Gone. I couldn't tell how long I stood there. When I finally made it inside, Edith was already waiting by the fireplace. She looked tired. More than tired. Hollowed out. But not afraid. "It's him," she said. "He always comes back when the road tries to take something." I told her what I saw. Every detail. She didn't blink once. "That's the son," she said softly. I knew it was him the second I saw the way he limped. She motioned for me to sit and pulled out an old box from beneath her chair. Inside was a stack of yellowed paper, folded notes, some old VHS tapes, a faded map of Fern Hollow with tiny red dots marked along the creek. I used to think I'd imagined all of it, that my memory was just clinging to something that made me feel less alone. But he's back now. Not the mother. Him. She reached out and touched my wrist. Her hands were cold. He's not just watching anymore, Rachel. He's remembering. And if he's remembering, it means something's chasing him that won't let him forget. I didn't sleep. I stayed by the window again that night. This time, I left the curtain drawn all the way back and turned the TV just slightly toward the woods. I let the light spill through the glass like an invitation. I whispered a thank you to nothing. And somewhere in the branches, the air shifted. Just enough to let me know it had been heard. The morning after he appeared at the window, something had shifted in the way the house felt. It wasn't just the air. It was in the floorboards, in the way the kettle took longer to boil, in the way Edith sat a little heavier in her chair. The cabin had absorbed it, the weight of his presence, like smoke clinging to old wood. I kept replaying the moment in my head, over and over. The slope of his shoulder, the way the light had flickered across his eyes, the deep scar curling beneath his ribcage. He hadn't looked at me. Not direct, but I felt seen in a way that rattled something loose inside me, something I didn't know had been clenched for years. Colby was in a bad mood from the moment he woke up. He paced the kitchen, muttering about heading back. needing to catch up on work, acting like the flat tire had been some personal attack. When I told him I wanted to stay an extra day, he nearly laughed. "You're staying because of the cartoons," he said. "Because some animal likes Looney Tunes." I didn't answer him. I just turned back toward the window, where the light from outside had gone a little duller, like the forest was exhaling through the trees. He stormed out a few minutes later. I didn't ask where he was going. Edith didn't say anything until after lunch. She was quieter now, and there was a thinness in her skin I hadn't noticed before. Her hands trembled when she lifted her teacup, and her breath came in shallow pulls. When I offered to call someone, she shook her head. "It's not something a doctor can fix," she said. It's not something that needs fixing. It just is." She asked me to help her to her bedroom and rested for a while with the door half cracked. I cleaned up the kitchen and wandered through the living room, thinking about everything she'd said, everything I'd seen. I sat on the floor and opened the box she'd left out the night before. There were more photographs. Some of people I didn't recognize, some of trees, some of the cabin from different angles, always with the same recurring shape in the shadows. It was never in focus, never in the center, but always there, watching. Near the bottom of the box was a folded piece of lined paper, yellowed and worn at the edges. The handwriting was small, slanted, neat. I didn't read all of it, just the first few lines. "If I go before he comes back, tell him I waited. Tell him I didn't forget. That I still keep the old stories where he can reach them." I folded it back up and tucked it away. My hands were shaking. That evening, as the light died in the trees, I turned on the TV again. I didn't ask. Edith was still resting, and something told me this part didn't need permission. The familiar intro music filled the cabin, and I opened the curtain wide. I didn't expect him to come back 2 nights in a row, but I think, deep down, I hoped. It wasn't long before I saw the movement again. Just a ripple at first, something that broke the rhythm of the trees. Then, a shape, not charging, not creeping, not just moving with intent, with memory. He stepped into the clearing slower this time. The limp was worse. He paused midway, lowering himself carefully onto one knee, and then, with effort, sat cross-legged in the grass. The distance between us was exactly the same, as if he knew the boundary. I stayed where I was. I didn't want to break it. I just watched him watch the screen, and then he lifted something. It was hard to see at first, a bundle of cloth, held gently in one massive hand. He placed it on the ground in front of him. The TV flickered, laughter rising. He didn't react, just kept his head tilted. His hand stayed near the cloth bundle, fingers splayed out like a shield. It took me a moment to understand. He was showing me something, offering it. I walked slowly to the door and opened it halfway, not stepping out. The cold hit my face, but I didn't flinch. I raised my hand, not waving, just acknowledging. I don't know why I did it, only that it felt right. He stayed a little longer that night. Long enough that the cartoon ended and another began. Long enough for me to memorize every part of him I could see. The muscle in his jaw. The way his chest rose and fell. The shine in his eyes that didn't blink as often as mine. When he finally stood, I saw how much pain he was in. The way his left leg dragged slightly. The way his back hunched. He turned to leave, but before he vanished into the trees, he looked back once. Just once. Not at the screen. At me. When I closed the door, Edith was standing behind me. Her voice was barely audible. "I think he remembers losing someone." I asked if she meant his mother. "No," she said. "I think he means me." She didn't cry, but I could see the storm gathering behind her eyes. I helped her back to her chair, and she stared out the window like she'd done for years. I think she was waiting for something more, but it didn't come that night. Just the shadows returning to their rightful places. Later, when I was alone, I stepped out onto the porch with a blanket and flashlight. The bundle he left behind was still there, just past the edge of the clearing. I approached slowly and knelt down. It was a piece of cloth, old, frayed. Inside, wrapped in careful layers of leaves, was a small carved figure, crude but detailed. A woman, with long hair and a round face, sitting in a chair. Her eyes were looking out a window, and she was smiling. I kept the carved figure on the nightstand beside the guest bed, tucked between a chipped ceramic lamp and an old stack of National Geographics Edith had probably forgotten she owned. I hadn't told Colby about it. I wasn't sure I'd ever tell anyone about it. It didn't feel like something meant to be explained. It felt like something left behind to be held, silently, gently, by someone who understood that not all gestures were meant for words. Edith hadn't gotten out of bed that morning. She said she just needed rest, that she was fine, that her body was just tired from carrying too much memory. I stayed close anyway. The house felt heavier by the hour. The floors creaked differently. The television, when I turned it on, seemed louder even at its lowest volume. Colby barely spoke to me anymore. He walked in and out of the cabin like a stranger who'd taken the wrong turn and refused to admit it. He never looked directly at the window. And that night, when I asked him to stay up with me, just once, to see what I'd seen, he told me he wasn't interested in participating in delusions. The door shut behind him harder than it needed to. He slept through everything. I don't know why I was so certain he would come back again. I just was. I didn't sit at the window this time. I stood. Something in me felt too restless, too full. I left the carved figure where it had been, in plain view. The TV was already playing. Something soft and wordless this time. The light it cast moved slower across the floor. Outside, the woods were windless. And then I saw him, not at the edge of the trees, closer. He wasn't walking this time. He was limping, badly, like the weight on one side of his body had doubled. I moved to the door and opened it halfway, staying inside the threshold, heart racing. He stopped near the porch, close enough that I could hear the shift of gravel beneath his foot. He didn't raise his head. I spoke, finally. Not loudly. He brought her back to me. He lifted his gaze. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I did. I saw her in his eyes. Something of Edith. Something ancient and kind and terribly alone. He didn't come closer. Just stood in that liminal space. Between the darkness and the house. Between the darkness and the house. Between leaving and staying. I wanted to cross the line he never had, but I didn't. I think she's leaving, I whispered. Soon, his head tilted. She waited for you. His breathing deepened, not fast, slow and steady. I think that was his way of answering. He stood there a while longer, then turned and melted into the tree line like smoke. I stayed at the doorway until the woods swallowed him whole. When I turned back, Edith's bedroom light was still off. I knew she hadn't seen him, but maybe that wasn't the point anymore. Maybe she didn't need to. The next morning, the world looked too normal. Colby had already packed. He said we'd overstayed the fantasy. He said it with a forced laugh, but there was something brittle behind it, like even he had started to question what he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Edith gave me a folded note when we hugged goodbye. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear. She didn't say she'd see me soon. She didn't have to. I didn't read the note until we were halfway down the highway, and Colby was asleep against the window. It was written in the same neat slanted hand from the letter I'd found in the box, only this time it was meant for me. If he comes again, and I'm no longer there, tell him I never closed the window. Tell him I left the cartoons on and the chair facing the trees. He'll know what it means. I didn't cry. Not then. But something lodged itself in the softest part of me and stayed there humming. We were back in Boise by evening, and nothing fit right. The walls of our apartment felt narrow, like they had shrunk while we were gone. The lights too bright, the silence too thin. I kept turning on the TV and flipping through channels, none of which felt like the right one. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, limping across the clearing, his hand on the cloth, the reflection of color dancing across his chest from the screen. 3 days later, the phone call came. Edith had passed quietly in her sleep. Peacefully, they said. I imagined her with her back to the window, her hand resting on the armrest, the chair slightly angled, the TV still playing something silly and beautiful. I went back alone. Colby didn't ask why. The house smelled the same. Nothing had been moved. The TV still sat beneath the window, unplugged. The curtains were drawn. The carved figure was gone. I sat in the same chair she always had, facing the woods. I waited, and for the first time, I didn't need him to come. I just wanted him to know someone was still there, still listening. That night, I left the curtain open. I placed the remote on the windowsill. I whispered one last sentence to the quiet outside the glass. She kept her promise, and just before I closed my eyes, I felt something shift in the wind, like the world had nodded back. I recorded this on a Monday. I don't know why that detail feels important, but it does. The light outside had that pale, uncertain quality it gets in early spring. More suggestion than warmth. I was sitting in Edith's old chair, facing the forest like she used to. The microphone clutched in my hand like something sacred. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral. The cabin hadn't changed much, neither had the woods, but the space between them had. I told myself this recording wasn't for anyone in particular. But of course it was. There's always someone you're talking to, even when you're alone. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was for me, but I started talking, and I didn't stop. I talked about the first time I met Edith, how her eyes didn't match her age, how she looked at the world like it was still full of unfinished conversations. I talked about the popcorn bowls, and the chair that turned on its own. About the laughter in the middle of the night that didn't belong to anyone in the house. I talked about the creature in the clearing, the figure made of silence and breath and pain. I described the scars, the way he never flinched when the cartoon music rose, the way his presence didn't fill the air so much as tune it differently, like a forgotten chord. I didn't name him. He didn't need a name. He didn't need a name. Some things lose their weight when you put them in a box labeled with letters. This wasn't for taxonomy. This was a story, and stories deserve to breathe. I told the listeners, whoever they might be, that Edith didn't die waiting. She died in the company of everything she'd ever loved, even the things most people told her weren't real. She died looking at the place where she used to see him, and I like to believe that even if he didn't come that night, he was near. I said she taught me that belief wasn't the absence of doubt. It was what you did with your doubt that mattered. She had doubt too. She just didn't let it close the window. When I finished recording, I didn't play it back. I uploaded it directly to the submission form on a podcast I'd followed for years, one that shared strange encounters and quiet hauntings. I typed the title in shaky hands, CRYPTID'S Den, the friend who came for the silence. Then I shut the laptop and walked outside. The clearing was empty, the trees unmoved. I stood on the porch with my eyes closed, listening. I waited. The air shifted. Not a storm, not the wind, just the feeling you get when someone steps into the back of a church and you haven't turned around yet. But you know they're there. I opened my eyes and saw nothing. But the stillness had changed. There was a shape in it. I stepped down from the porch and crossed the clearing with slow, deliberate steps. When I reached the edge of the woods, I knelt down and placed something into the dirt. The remote, the same one Edith used for years. The buttons worn smooth, still warm from my hand. I whispered something I hadn't said out loud before. I'll keep the chair turned. I'll keep the light on. And then I walked back to the house without looking behind me. That night, the TV turned on by itself. The sound was low, almost too low to register. Just a faint tune. The kind that loops endlessly in old cartoons. I didn't move. I just listened. And then I saw it. The window fogged. Just a little. A single breath. The palm against the glass. Large, steady, familiar. I didn't run to it. I didn't need to. The hand stayed there for maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10. Then it was gone. And somehow I knew he wasn't coming closer tonight. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't have to. Because this wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about being remembered. And he was. That night I slept with the window uncovered and the TV humming softly through the dark. I dreamed of the forest and a figure that moved, not like a shadow, but like something too tired to hide anymore. In the morning, the remote was gone. In its place was a single pine cone, worn smooth like river stone, sitting exactly where I'd left it. I think that's how it works in the end. Not with big gestures or loud miracles, but with quiet replacements, little traits, a piece of truth, exchanged for silence. A flicker of presence, exchanged for memory. And now I sit here, speaking into a recorder, hoping someone somewhere hears this and understands that this wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a confession. It was gratitude. Because I saw him. And he saw me. And somehow that was enough to make the world feel a little less broken. So if you're out there and you've heard stories like this and thought they were nonsense, I get it. I used to be you. But sometimes the wild doesn't vanish because it's hiding. Sometimes it steps back because we're too loud, too proud, too busy proving everything instead of feeling anything. But if you're quiet long enough, if you leave the window cracked and the screen glowing, you might find something looking back, something gentle, something that never asked for anything but a place to return to. If that ever happens, do me a favor. Don't close the curtain. Don't turn away. Just sit down. Let it be what it is. And when it leaves, let it leave something behind. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones filled with spectacle or answers. They're the quiet ones. The ones that sit with you long after the telling, asking nothing, proving nothing, just waiting for you to feel what they left behind. In a world so desperate to label, define, and divide, there's something deeply sacred about what can't be categorized. Something profoundly human in the things we don't fully understand, but still choose to honor. Because maybe the point was never about proving what exists. Maybe it was about showing what matters. The kindness that crosses boundaries without needing permission. The presence that doesn't speak, but stays. The connection that doesn't fit in a photograph or a sentence, but fills a room nonetheless. We live in a time that values noise, louder voices, brighter screens, faster everything. But in the stillness between all that noise, there's a different kind of truth. One that's older than words. One that knows grief doesn't always end. That love doesn't always look the way we expect. And that sometimes, the act of sitting with something, without needing to fix it, is the most radical thing we can do. This story wasn't about a monster. It wasn't about fear. It was about presence, about patience, about the quiet bravery of not turning away. And in that stillness, we're reminded that even in the loneliest places, especially in the loneliest places, there is meaning. There is memory. And there's always something reaching back, even if only to remind us we were never alone. Thank you for spending time here. If this story spoke to something in you, some memory, some ache, some hope, I'd love to hear what it stirred. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just let us know where you're listening from. If you'd like to hear more stories that walk the line between the wild and the deeply human, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and help keep this space alive. Until next time, keep your windows cracked, your lights warm, and your heart open. There's more out there than we think.